weapons are going to continue to flow, and we are going to continue to supply them.
So with these tanks going to Ukraine, the conflict's approaching the year mark, of course. We're getting close to February, the one-year anniversary of the conflict. Could this be a significant turning point? Dr. Mike Martin is War Studies Senior Visiting Fellow at King's College London, has helped us really for the last year understand what's going on in Ukraine militarily. Morning to you, Mike.
Morning again.
I guess the question is, should this have happened sooner? And it happening now, will it have a clear effect?
It probably could have happened a bit quicker. I mean, throughout the year, we've seen the weapons demands change. So originally it was anti-armor, and then it was anti-air, and then it was artillery, and now it's tanks. And really those different weapons demands have tracked the different stages of the conflict, largely as Ukraine has moved from defensive at the beginning of the war now into a position where they've had a couple of successful offensives, and now we're looking at what they do as a spring offensive. So I don't think, giving Ukraine tanks a year ago would have helped. But equally, each decision has really taken time to build consensus and get everyone, on the same page. So it would be probably helpful if we could make the decisions a little bit quicker.
And can these tanks be brought in time, workable, with people trained to use them for a spring offensive?
I mean, it's touch and go. It really now is really the last safe moment that they could have made that decision. The first thing they've got to do is strip out. Obviously, all the tanks have got some sensitive equipment in them, optics, communications. All that needs to be stripped out. Then at the same time, Ukrainian tank crews need to be trained on them, and not just one crew per tank, but replacement crews and all the rest of it. And then they need to have a bit of training, and then the tanks need to be actually got into Ukraine and the logistics to supply them, because obviously ammunition, fuel, all the rest of it, spare parts particularly, all of that needs to be got in. So they're not going to we're looking at a minimum of 6 weeks really from that decision being made to some of those tanks appearing on the battlefield.
Okay, so if we're saying a sort of March offensive, that might well work.
Yeah.
How provocative is this then? Because I've struggled throughout this that once you start arming Ukrainians, which we have been doing for some time, that seems to be an act of provocation. Then it's just a question of scale. Is this vastly more? I mean, people have died with Western provide ordnance for the last year. Russian soldiers have died. Is this vastly different to that? Is there a danger of excess provocation here?
I don't really buy into this provocation argument. I mean, Russia goes on and on and on about it, but a lot of that is just empty rhetoric. Russia's fighting a genocidal war against Ukraine. We've found mass graves in towns and in villages and in forests. And so really, how is it that they escalate? They've only got a couple of options. They can either widen the war and say attack Poland, but they'd have to, they'd need to have their heads feeling to do that, because those countries are covered under the NATO Article 5 security guarantee. And the only other option is to go nuclear, and that's not in their interest either, because going nuclear finishes the war very quickly against Russia. It doesn't finish it on Russia's side. There's absolutely no way that the Americans, the Brits and the French, which are the nuclear powers on the other side of the conflict, are going to allow Putin to use nuclear weapons on the European continent. So I think what we're going to see from Russia is lots of words. As your correspondent said, missile attacks into civilian areas, which are basically, as terrible as they are, is militarily impotent. I mean, they're not even attacking military targets. And yeah, I think, as you say, these weapons are going to continue to flow, and we are going to continue to supply them.
And you've been, I think, one of the more optimistic voices when you looked at sort of the prognosis for the situation. Do you believe that the spring offensive will herald a push south and east that really that kicks Russian forces out of Ukraine?
Well, look, it's all to play for. I think both sides are going to try and have a spring offensive. The Russians are going to try and finish off what they're doing in the east, in the Donbas, because Putin has said that's his political aim. So they want to finish taking the rest of those two provinces. So that's why we've seen them losing so many troops trying to take places like Bakhmut, and they took Solidar just recently. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are going to try and push, I suspect, south from Zaporizhzhia, because if they can cut across that narrow bit of land that joins the Russian troops in the Crimea up to the Russian troops in the east, then they can cut the Russian forces in two. And whilst that won't finish the Russians off in Ukraine, it makes their position very, very, very difficult.
It's worth keeping an eye on. Great to speak to you as ever, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
That's Dr. Mike Martin, War Studies Senior Visiting Fellow at King's College London.